Welcome to Ride Studio Café. I'm Patria Lanfranchi, co-owner and curator. Ride Studio Café is a friendly and welcoming and professional bike shop and coffee shop. Describe the different ways to roast a coffee. And the different roast types. There's French, Italian, light, dark.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways of describing the roast.
Yeah. We're still learning that. Roasting is an incredibly, we're like farmers and processors and so on, we're all just learning because specialty coffee is literally still in a learning stage. We're about 100 years behind the wine world that way. We're only gaining sophistication now because we're coming out of a purely commercial commodity market. And the specialty world has only been around for a couple of decades, really. So we're learning. And in roasting, it's the same way. There is no science at this point of roasting, really. There is no one way to do it. So we're all learning, at least this is the way I see it, by trial and error, completely. Many of us have machines that are from Germany or from way back when that are very sturdy, that do a very good job as you start to learn. I have learned by trial and error, as most people in specialty have. Now it's not the case anymore because now there are peers who can teach. But in my times, there was no one. You literally taught yourself. And so it's trial and error over and over again. So you have, as you start to roast, you can roast anywhere from literally, to do a regular roast, it can take you anywhere from 2 minutes to 20 minutes or more. So it's a wide scale. The really fast roast, 2 or 3 minutes, these are jet roasts, and they produce very poor quality. So we're not interested in that. The general roasting for specialty is somewhere between 10 minutes, 9, 10 minutes, up to about 14, 15 minutes. If I just consider for a moment time, and I'm roasting on a kind of a bell curve, you know, your light roast, the first step that happens, the first half of your roast is getting rid of the moisture that's in the bean itself. You're starting at about 11% moisture. You're bringing it down to about 3 or 4% moisture at the end of the roast, in a lighter roast. So for the first 4 or 5 minutes, you are simply drying that bean out. Then the roasting process itself begins, and you start to go into the Maillard reactions, where you get the browning of the coffee bean. The sugars start to develop on the surfaces. And the beans, at one point, the moisture that's still in the coffee starts to vaporize quickly enough that it starts to pop, much like popcorn. And you have this popping sound happening. It's called first crack, if you will. And so the moisture comes out. The bean now starts to brown more and more over the next couple of minutes. The temperature is still rising. You're at about 400 degrees, 405 Fahrenheit at that time. And now you can take it darker. So you might stop, if you're Scandinavian or whatever, you could stop within the first minute after that popping sound as it starts. Very light brown tones. You could go a little bit further, which is where we tend to go, about a minute to 2 minutes after this popping sound has really reached its peak, which is where we like our, what we call full flavor to go for drip coffee, not espresso. You can take it further, and at a certain point, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, as you start to reach 415 degrees, 420, there's a second popping that is softer than the first. It's more like a sizzling sound, and it's called second crack. This is when the beans, the cellular walls really crack open, and the oils will now start to bleed to the surface. So if we were to stop that right at that point, that's what we call a Vienna roast. And this is very popular today. In most restaurants, that's what they're serving you, this second pop. Stumptown, I think, is just around there or just before the second pop. When you go from this lighter roast to second pop, you are eliminating more and more of the acidity, the liveliness in the coffee. And you are replacing it with duller, but also potentially what a person who likes dark roast would say is richer notes, more chocolate notes. You are also, though, eliminating the fruit notes that you get, like in here. These start to go away. These are more from acids, citric acid, acetic acid, and malic acid, and so on. These start to diminish. The more subtle flavors start to go away, and you get the richer tones, the nut flavors, the heavy chocolates, the earthier notes that come with the darker roast, and more robust flavor in general. It's more aggressive in flavor. Take it further, more and more oils start to come out. More and more smoke is being produced as you go darker and darker until you hit French roast. And back in the days of early Coffee Connection, we did all the way to, we did Vienna roast. We did a lighter roast, which we called, I think it was called City or Full City back in those days. Then we did Vienna roast. Then we did New Orleans, which is a step darker. Then we did French roast. Then we did Italian roast. And we stopped doing Italian because right after Italian calls Pompeii roast. And we had a few of those. And that's massive amounts of smoke that's happening. In fact, when we're doing this in Burlington, and we were doing this at night, because in the morning we'd have to go sell the coffee we actually roasted at night, we would have the fire department come out a few times with axe in hand, right? Because of the smoke we were producing. At that point, we didn't even have an afterburner. And we were doing it one time in the daytime, and I remember it was this really low pressure zone, and so the air was not moving, and the smoke went up, and it just moved, and then it dropped onto another building. And a few minutes later, people started coming out of the building. So this is how we learn. So I don't know quite where the roasting. Right, so it's more complex than that. How you get to these roasts is really critical. You can apply, if you drop the coffee in and you've got a really high heat in the beginning, you can singe the coffee. It's like a sunburn that happens. You don't even see it. And it can add a bitter note to the coffee. So you can get these really light tastes and good acidity, but a bitterish note that happens. So you have to be very careful. I compare it a little bit like in the beginning of a roast is like catching a raw egg that's been thrown really fast at you. If you just put your hand out, it's going to splatter. If you have your hand going backwards as you catch it, it's not going to do that. You really want to back away and then go forward. And so you have to treat it very delicately. Each bean is different. Some are higher grown. The higher grown they are, generally they tend to be harder shelled and denser. And you're going to treat that differently than a softer bean that might be lower grown, a different variety, different size. All of these things are going to come into play. So literally every coffee you get has to be played with. The first roasts we come out with are often not our best roasts, to be honest, right? We'll get a new Kenya in or whatever. We need a week or two to get it right. And sometimes even longer, to finally zero in and get it exactly where we want. The Karatu, which we're serving now, we had a devil of a time first few weeks. I think Sal can remember that. And I know Jenny remembers it, right? And now the Karatu is sensational. But we really struggled with it in the very beginning to get it right. So it's trial and error. We need to get much further than that. I see there needs to be a day when we arrive and there is not only the craft of roasting and the art of it, but there is a science as well. And that has not been developed, not by the roasting companies and not by the people who make the roasters. This is still in development. So.
Excellent. So speaking of the Karatu and the next sample, these guys need to do some grinding. So.
Okay. So you'll see that every purveyor, every roaster of coffee, we can serve the same coffee. You can have the same Santa Clara from somebody else and it'll be quite different, right? I am looking for as much sweetness as I can possibly get. We do 2 quality control setups. In the daytime when we're roasting, Jennifer and Sal some of the time too, particularly with the espresso, we'll be tasting coffees as they're literally coming out of the roaster, on the spot. Are we on target or not? You know, you have to watch out because you can imagine how caffeinated you get, but you're cupping this and you're doing it. The other way is that every morning when we wake up, 6 o'clock, 6:30, I, my wife, and Jennifer, we make a pot of coffee in the same machine, which is an automatic, because I'm not interested in the craft of doing it and all the rest. I'm interested in repeatedly doing exactly the same brew each and every time with the same amount of water, same grams, everything, because I only want one variable, the cup of coffee, the coffee itself. That's what I'm looking at. And before I've eaten anything or anything else, I will drink that, taste it when it's, smell it, taste it when it's hot, record what my sensations are when it's hot. When it's cooling off, which is really where the coffee blooms, where it really starts to happen. It's not when it's hot. I think it is for dark roast. This is a big difference in aesthetics. The dark roast is very aggressive, and it's at its peak, in my opinion, when it's quite hot. Lighter roasted coffee, like the kind we do, comes into its own at about 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Right? Piping hot, by the way, is about 155. As we were taking temperatures all along, right? It's pretty hot already at 155. So you're brewing at 201, down to 155. That's where you start to be able to taste, and you have to be careful not to burn your tongue. At 135, it's warmer than room temperature, but not that much warmer. And now all the flavors really exploding, really coming out. The most it's going to give is right around there. And by the way, this is the kind of the rule as well for traditional cuppers. It's been this way at about 135. So 135 down to 110 is this peak of flavor that you get. And so I'm going to be doing a 20, 30-minute tasting of my coffee. Sometimes I will notice when it's hot a bitterness in the very beginning that I don't like. But as it cools, the bitterness goes away, and now sweet flavors start to come on. And then I start to notice fruit notes. And there are these transitions that the coffee goes through. So it really is, with a good cup of coffee, a great kind of trip that you do for 20 to 30 minutes as it changes. And so I'm happy with the roast when that middle area is really singing. Like, I'm happy with this coffee right now that we've had, right? And again, this is in the interest of complete transparency, right? I would not give this a 100% score in the roasting point of view, right? In the beginning, when it's hot, I noticed a slight amount of bitterness, like a slight sunburn, right? Now that went away as it started to cool. And I noticed a lot of sweetness and fruit notes, right? When Matt, our roaster who's doing these, and he's really good, gets a perfect 100 is where it's sweet from the moment it's hot all the way to cold, right? But this is very good. So that's what we aim at. Other people look for other things. For chewier, I like paper drip, where you have to do it in a very careful way and such, but I like a clear cup of coffee because I'm after flavor notes, the sweetness, the flavor notes, and so on. Others, darker roast, more so, French press, this kind of thing, thicker, chewier coffees. French press, you get the fine sediment running through it, the dust. This creates a mouthfeel that's very different than a drip. You exchange, there's less flavor because that sediment coats your tongue, coats the pores of your tongue. You're not as sensitive to certain things anymore. Whereas with a drip, it's all flavor that's coming through, and the aromatics carry better, at least from my perception. I can go on, but go ahead with
That's
the question.
exactly what I want you to go on about.
Yep.
Definitely, if you could explain more about the various brew methods. Right now, our baristas are hard at work on Chemexes,
Right.
which is how they're creating our coffee this evening. We also have something called the Kalita Wave, which is how we've been making our individual cup of coffees.
Yes, which is
and
very
we had
good.
V60s prior to the Kalita Wave. So if you could explain a little bit more about each of those brewing methods. that'd be
Yeah,
great.
there are so many different methods, and it really, we all have our preferences, and there is no single one that's absolutely better than another. It depends what you like. You know, you can legitimately like a heavier cup of coffee, one that is more textured and more chewy, and another person like myself might like it another way. And coffee should provide all of those cups, right? The ideal coffee house way out there in the future is like a wine store. I may not like sherry, but if I'm a really good wine store, believe me, I'm going to carry really terrific sherries, and I'm going to want to be knowledgeable about it and get you good value to really great ones. I'm sure that wine purveyors don't love every wine they sell, but they want to carry a variety. And it's the same way with coffee. There should be a variety of roasts. There are different times. Several years ago, I would go into restaurants, they might have been my customers, and they wanted our dark roast. And I wasn't very happy about that. But today, I realize there's a time and a place. If I've really had a heavy dessert, if I've had a lot of this amazing meal or whatever, sometimes the darker roast actually is very good. Whereas in the morning, I want a light roast. So the time of day, what you're eating it with, all of these things go together. So how you brew is connected to that as well. You might want a French press for a particular occasion. And I had a French press the other day that absolutely floored me at a new restaurant in Newton that's selling our coffees. They used a Vienna roast. It was unbelievably sweet and chocolatey. So, you know, again, while I gravitate towards one way of doing it, this was made in a French press, really strong, and I was in love with it. So that said, there are many different ways. And you can go from cold brew, which this is the one I'm having my struggle with now, iced coffee, where you're not applying any heat to the coffee at all, but you're letting cold water sit with coffee for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, and there are many different ways to do this. But this, you are now drinking something that to me is more connected to the beer world and is a concoction, right? Essentially, because what you're doing is you are oxidizing the coffee big time. While it sits there for 12 to 24 hours, it's oxidizing. One. Two, I suspect the flavors that I get are vanilla and this bourbon wood note, like in bourbon, the alcohol, right? Where's that coming from? That's not in a regularly brewed coffee, and yet it's in the cold brew. And I think, for lack of anything else, that it is the cellular walls that are essentially wood, lignin, that are slowly being dissolved over 24 hours and entering into the drink. So you are creating a special drink that is no longer about what's the typical, the brewing process itself, which the hot water with the ground coffee produces certain acids, produces chemical reactions that don't happen with cold water at all. So you're really doing something else. And you're getting more of a generic note. The vanilla, the wood note, the bourbon, it's common to all the cold brew coffees, right? You can get a varietal note. The Ethiopian varietal note that you'll taste at the end will come through in the cold brew because it's very powerful, and it doesn't require heat to produce that particular note. But other notes won't come through. So cold brew is a particular concoction using coffee that can be more or less really good, that can have unique flavor notes, and that, again, you can vary. You can do a little bit of hot water mixed in with cold water. You can use pressure. There's a whole lot of different variations you can do. So this is still in transition and developing as we speak. But notice that cold brew is put into dark bottles and so on. It sells like a beer. It's got that whole mentality of beer. It's not a wine-like drink. So anyway, going further, then you get drip and many different ways, from Chemex to the Kalita, which is really an excellent system. I've been very impressed with it in terms of how well it extracts, as well as the Chemex, of course. And then the V60. These are things for every person to explore. What's easiest for you? What doesn't? Right now, what would I recommend? I'd recommend the Kalita or the Chemex. Right? Both of them, to my mind, are really impressive. If you want an automatic, the Bonavita is the one we're looking at, and there's new Bonavitas coming out. They're very simple. They will be flat. We'll have a flat filter as opposed to the V Melita shape that I think is very promising, but that's another topic. So you get the French press, which again is forced down, pushing the grounds downwards and creating a much thicker beverage that is no longer transparent, that you can get rid of more and more of the sediment, but there's always some sediment and the drink is milkier. And again, to my mind, there you add more coffee, you make it much stronger, and it is this chocolate-like brew that can be really extraordinary. It tends to under-extract, okay? Because you need to have the right temperature for the right amount of time. If you go below around 200 degrees, 201 degrees, the more you go below 195, the less you're extracting from the coffee bean. You pour the hot water into the ground coffee in a typical French press, which is glass, just one thickness around, and that water's cooling very rapidly. And so you're only extracting 17, 16% of what's in the coffee grounds, which is why people tend to put more grounds in order to, they're under extracting, but they're extracting a whole lot more, and they're getting a certain amount of strength. So either you get double walled French press or a towel around it or something to keep it hotter, and you will get a better extraction. 19, 20% is really where you want to go. You can over-extract coffee, in which you get flavors that are not so good, that are harsh, or you can under-extract and you don't get all of the notes that coffee can produce. So that's the French press. Then you get things in between. The AeroPress has become very popular. It looks like a giant syringe, right? And you make a very fine grind, and then you press it. It's a coffee that I find most valuable for traveling and such, but it's not one that I have had the time to experiment with as much as I would like. Again, my world is the coffee itself, and that's the one I explore most in depth. And I then defer to people like Sal and to others who have, in some cases, better knowledge. None of us in the coffee world can have all knowledge about all aspects, right? Mine's the coffee piece. And another one is, of course, espresso, which is the other end. To me, you've got drip on one end and espresso on the other. And everything else is in between, French press and so on. The stovetop filter coffee makers, that are called espresso makers as well, the Napolitanos and all of these. Neapolitan? Yeah. But in any case, so the espresso, if the drip coffee is like a wine, clear, see-through, flavor, the espresso is like a brandy. It is 6 to 12 times more concentrated than a full-blown drip, right? Consider that a drip coffee, when I make a good drip like this, is approximately 98.7% water, and only 1.3% is coffee. That's how little it is. If you want a stronger cup, I can take it to 1.4, and it's substantially stronger. You will notice that difference, 1.4% versus 1.3%. That's how powerful coffee is as a flavor component. Now take espresso. Illy espresso, classic Italian, is 6 to 7 times more dense, more concentrated than that drip. The new wave has gone way further than that, and they've taken it to 11 to 12 times the power. So when an Italian comes to the States or Australia, hits third wave, it's like fireworks time, right? They cannot believe that they are tasting this overpowering thing to them, which is overwhelming to them, right? To them, the espresso we drink in third wave places, this is one place, my cafe is the same way, is too powerful and lacks subtlety. In the long run, I'd like to see the whole range. Really potent to classic Italian. They all have their points, right? So that's a little bit about brewing. I could go on about that. But, the other one I should mention is siphon, which was more popular a few years ago, but which is a unique and very valid way to do it, and it is gorgeous. And of course, that is, the standard one is the figure 8 one that used to be popular. Our grandparents and parents used to do this back in the 50s and 40s. Then it was a common machine, which was a figure 8. The bottom piece, you had the water, and you put the grounds up above, and you had a filter in between, and you'd light a flame underneath, and the water would come to a near boil, start to bubble down below, and a vacuum would be formed with all the water going uprising through a tube to the grounds up above and mixing in with that. And then you just mix it together. You would wait a certain amount of time with the water bubbling down below. There's always a certain amount of water that remains down below so the glass doesn't crack, stays up there, and then you just kill the flame, and now that vacuum reverses itself and sucks in the liquid that comes back into the bottom container, and you can serve coffee from that. That can serve a very clear coffee, just like a drip, and really with exquisite, very fine nuances as well. It takes more practice, more time. It's something you really have to love doing, right? Be very manual about it. So that's the other type that I should really bring up.